So today I'm reviewing a book which I've just finished, and it's an old favourite that I've read many times. It is The Silver Metal Lover by Tanith Lee. It's a spectacular book. I absolutely love it. I'm sure we all know there's this author that you love, and that author is deceased. Tanith Lee unfortunately passed away in 2015. And when that happens to you, you realise that that's it. What you've got is all you're ever going to get. There's going to be no more books from them. And that's when I start to sort of cherish the books. I keep them carefully. I don't let myself reread them too often. And this one I haven't reread for a few years, but I've read it many times. I think it is a genius book, and it is possibly one of the best romances I've ever read. It is definitely the best science fiction romance that I've ever read. It is a spectacular, perfect book in itself. And yes, I'm going to start with reading the first chapter. So chapter 1 has its own little title page, and genius, pure genius. Mother, I am in love with a robot. No, she isn't going to like that. Mother, I am in love. Are you, darling? Oh, yes, Mother, yes, I am. His hair is urban, and his eyes are very large, like amber, and his skin is silver. Silence. Mother, I'm in love. With whom, dear? His name is Silver. How metallic. Yes, it stands for Silver Ionized Locomotive Verisimulated Electronic Robot. Silence, silence, silence. Mother? So this beginning is genius. It is a complete hook. And in actual fact, like I said, I think the whole book, start to finish, is genius in every word. And all the 240 pages of fairly small font writing, the author does not put a single foot wrong. It is one of those small gems of classic science fiction that sets your head spinning with the skill and creativity of the author. And when you finish reading it, you feel like it's this diamond sparkling in the light. Brilliant, full of facets, and it will keep you thinking about it forever and ever. At least that's how I feel about this truly amazing book. Now, what makes it more amazing is the author. Tanith Lee is a hit or miss author for me. She had a stellar career. She had more awards than you could believe. A lot of spectacularly good books and stories, which made the occasional one that I felt was a steaming pile of horse shite even more bewildering. Because when she did it right, it was so perfect. And when she did it wrong, it was so boring. Now, she didn't write a lot of science fiction, and I think probably a lot of modern science fiction readers wouldn't even think of this as science fiction. They'd call it fantasy or speculative fiction. But in the 1980s, when it was written, it was science fiction. And while Tanith wrote a lot of mythological fiction and fantasy, the ones that were closer to the science fiction mark, I think, always worked very well for me. Two more of hers, Don't Bite the Sun and Drinking Sapphire Wine, also are verging into the speculative fiction meets science fiction, and they also work very well for me. I feel that her science fiction was better. Anyway, in The Silver Metal Lover, Tanith Lee provides a very strongly rendered technological future. There's not hard science in it, but the drawing of this future world is very strong and makes it a very believable, rich place for the story to take place. So, unlike some authors, she hasn't given a date, so you can believe all of this is in the near future. So somewhere in our near future, an asteroid hits a collision course with Earth. It doesn't actually hit Earth. It gets diverted and goes into orbit. But the turmoil in terms of earthquakes, tsunamis, general turmoil that occur on the Earth means that civilization kind of reforms itself. It may not actually collapse, but it certainly isn't what it is today. And the society that comes out of that is one where robots feature heavily. They do most of the menial tasks, they do a lot of the household tasks, and as a consequence you've got a level of poverty that I don't think it's like the level of poverty today, but it's not something you can get out of easily. And I'm not going to go too much into that part of the social aspect of it. Now, in terms of science, there's a whole heap of things. You've got robot cabs, so there's still some human-operated cabs which are a feature. The mother of our protagonist, Jane, lives in a house that has supports, but basically floats somewhere in the atmosphere. And we're never really told how, only that it does. If someone did do a review on all the science that's in these books of Tanith Lee's and how they worked out, I think they probably would work out. It's just she doesn't go into it. So even though the world building in this book is great, at the end of the day, this story is more about intelligence, individuation, and self-growth, and what it means to be a person. So our main protagonist, who wrote our little chapter 1 introduction, is Jane. Jane is 15, I think, at the time when this story starts. She's a very protected, childish 16-year-old. She still lives in her mother's house, whereas most of her friend circle have moved out and live on their own. She is part of a very privileged, extremely wealthy upper class, but her relationship with her mother, how bad it is and in what ways it's bad, that changes for me with every reading. Her mother is controlling, and early on it's clear that her mother is manipulating her in many ways, but Jane sort of wafts through life vaguely. She spends a lot of time doing nothing much in particular. Her mother is brilliant, but Jane would rather sit and watch the clouds and read. She is deeply, deeply emotional, at least in the first part of the book while she's living with her mother. She is, in essence, a child. And in this book, she has a story arc of individuation and growth and maturity, which is startlingly effective to read. There's a lot of other things about Jane's world. She's sort of coddled in this world of the privileged house that she lives in, the privileged society she moves in. She's got this friend group, and we never find out how she achieved this friend group. But she doesn't actually like most of them, and she doesn't have anything much in common with any of them. And it feels as if part of her mother's concept of what her daughter has to be is how she looks, because her hair gets colour essenced into the shade chosen by her mother, what body size she is, which is regulated by pills that are ordered by her mother, what friends she has, all of that. Anyway, from this incredibly constrictive, narrow background, and yet so lush and so wealthy and so privileged, Jane one day encounters a robot, and that's Silver. A particular firm that produces robots has brought out this specialist line. There's 3 silver models, 2 boys and a girl, who sing and play. There's a golden range, I think they do acrobatics and martial arts. There's a copper range that are actors, and they've sent them out in the city to sort of become advertised. Jane's response to the silver is incredibly complicated and confusing and difficult for her to deal with. But at the end of the day, she falls deeply in love with him, passionately, emotionally in love with him, and through a series of activities that no one could, least of her herself, could ever believe that she'd engage in, she gets possession of him. Now, this is where the individuation really starts, because Jane is evolving into an adult. She's pretty much fled from her mother's place, taking as much money as she can in order to pay for Silver, and they're living in the slum, and Silver views her as his owner, and he's been programmed to make humans happy and to love them all pretty much equally. And yes, Okay, so there's a kinky element to a lot of Tanith Lee's writing, but basically here you've got passionate love between a human and a robot, and that includes sexual love, though the sex isn't particularly graphic. It's the emotional part that matters. Because as Jane does not view Silver as a robot, she treats him as a human, and she demands that behaviour from him. For a start, he has to pretend to be a human so that they won't be traced by the manufacturers, but also she wants him to behave like a human. She wants him to be viewed as a human by other humans. She wants him to respond to her on emotional and self-analytic levels that he says he isn't programmed to do, but that's what she wants, and so he starts to do that. Now, in the early 80s when this was published, the question of artificial intelligence was very, very current and very, very vivid and very much at the forefront of most science fiction, I think. And cyberpunk was coming into play as well. Even more so, artificial intelligence was important for cyberpunk. But I think it's still a worthwhile topic. And in this book, the first time I read it, I thought, wow, that's brilliant. And I loved it. But each time I read, I get more things from the book reading than I got last time. And in this one, I got the fact that the way the artificial intelligence is addressed here is actually a little bit eerie, because you never know. Jane thinks of Silver as a person. She demands behavior that is human and self-aware and loving from him. Silver is programmed to make people happy. So is his increasing self-awareness his program or his individuation? Is this journey to self-awareness any different from that of an organic person? And does it essentially matter? It matters to them, and they discuss it a bit, but it's quite eerie the way she makes you think about it. At least on this reading, I found it eerie. So, again, I'm going to read a bit more because there's no way that I can describe this better than Tanith herself describes it. I'm sorry, I said. I was subconsciously and consciously trying to drive you into feeling human. I thought he'd laugh. He didn't. I do feel human, he said at last. I'm supposed to feel human in order to act in a human manner. But there are degrees. I know I'm a machine that behaves like a man and partly feels like a man, but which doesn't exactly emote like a man. Except that, probably very unfortunately, I've gained emotional reflexes where you're concerned. Viewed logically, he said, all that happens is that I'm responding to your own response. You react to me in a particular way, an emotive way, and I react to your reaction. I'm simply fulfilling your need, if you like. No, I don't like. I'm tired of you're fulfilling my needs. I want to fulfill yours. What do you need, Silver? He raised his eyes and looked at me. His eyes seemed to go a long way back, like sideways seas, horizontal depths. You see, he said, nobody damn well says, what do you need to a bloody robot? Which reminds me how beautifully descriptive the writing is. The scenery is so beautifully described. It is stunning. It is spectacular. The literary authors who are described as having brought landscapes to life, I mean, many of them were actually inspirations for Tanith Lee's writing, but her writing is spectacularly beautiful, and she manages to go over the top with some of her descriptions because she's attributing to them to Jane, and Jane has been forced into self-depreciation. So whenever she uses a metaphor or description, she says, well, it's probably wrong. Until, through association with Silver, she becomes more herself. And in terms of a love affair, this is stunning, it's brilliant, and at the time it was written, I'm pretty convinced it was unique. I think it's still quite unique in the way two people become more than what they were. Yeah, I could rave about this book for ages. I haven't met very many people who've read it. Maybe one or two. My sister's read it. I've never had a chance to really discuss it at length with anyone because so few people that I know have read it. It's overall, since the 80s, one of my favourite books, which I will reread and reread over and over again, ad infinitum. Spoiler? Go away if you don't want a spoiler. It is not a happy ending. think Romeo and Juliet almost level unhappy ending. But while unhappy endings can be predicted and telegraphed, and it is telegraphed here a little bit, the manner in which the ending rolls forward through the narrative until it rolls you down is as spectacular. It's hard to imagine a happy ending that could have been anywhere near as ultimately satisfying in terms of emotional attachment to a story as this unhappy ending is. I like happy endings. I don't see the problem with having a happy ending. But in order to have as spectacularly good an ending as this book provides, I can deal with unhappy ones. Now, Tanith had spiritualistic interests and so forth, and there is a soul type reincarnation seancey feel to the end of it, which I would argue makes even more satisfying, because your ending isn't necessarily your ending. It might well continue on. And in actual fact, it does continue on. There's a sequel to this book, which I'm not going to read straight away because it's so dramatically different from this one, it needs space in between them. Rich poetic prose and striking imagery are two of the things that Tanith Lee has been noted for, and the lush, vibrant, exotic richness of her writing from page to page will make it beautiful for everyone, I think. There are... Look, that's it. It's a marvellous book. It's beautifully written. It is spectacular. It addresses themes that in science fiction were so relevant in the 80s, but it manages to do it without feeling dated. This book hasn't dated hardly at all. This future universe world isn't our world, and probably could never be where our world ends up in. There's things that are missing, like mobile phones, that really date it. But in other aspects, the trajectory of evolution of technology that you see in this book is not unrealistic for our world in general. It's got gorgeous writing, it's got excellent characters, it's got a story arc that is so intent it feels like acceleration out of the atmosphere. And yeah, beyond a doubt, one of the best the best sci-fi romance I've ever read. One of the best romances I've ever read. I can't think of more than 3 or 4 that even compare with it. It's hard at times, it's cruel, it makes you think about humanity, and humanity often aren't a nice thing when you think about them, because it makes you question what it means to be human and what humans will do to other people in the name of their own humanity, and how much they can discount human feeling in order to do those things. So the dehumanization as well as the individuation is really quite hard, harsh, scary, truthful. So many feelings that this book can invoke. If you are into this kind of book, I would thoroughly recommend it. If you like classic science fiction and you haven't read Tanith Lee's classic science fiction, you are seriously missing out. And now I'm going to move on to a totally different style. I'm thinking Theodore Sturgeon. He was one of Tanith Lee's influences. He might be my next one.